Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And today is the end of May, and I'm going to record my basically what I call second episode of So You Want to Buy Property in Singapore. And let us start. Okay, so a bit of introduction about myself. My name is Ryan Khoo, and I am a Malaysian. I am a Singapore permanent resident, and I've been in Singapore since 2009. But in and out of Malaysia, actually, I consider myself someone that lives in both cities, Johor Bahru and Singapore. And basically, I'm a property investor. I am a property agent. I have been investing for many, many years, and I have conducted probably more than a quarter billion worth of property transactions across my career. And one thing I do is I spend a lot of time trying to get Malaysians and Singaporeans to understand better how to buy properties in their own countries and in the other countries, because I think Malaysia and Singapore are very closely intertwined economically and socially. And you have seen me in the past doing a lot of talks and presentations for Property Guru, iProperty, The Age. I used to write articles for The Age in Singapore. And yeah, so I think that's pretty much my credentials. So the reason why I did this, normally I talk about Malaysia investment, property investment, but the last video and this one, actually I'm going to focus a bit about how to buy property in Singapore. Reason being is because I get this question fairly often as well. Many people in Malaysia are always interested on how to buy in Singapore, and a lot of Malaysians working in Singapore have maybe worked a few years and they have interest to buy Singapore property, and they also don't know where to start and maybe make some wrong comparisons because they're only familiar with what they have in their home country. So in this video, this is the target audience, and basically we're going to talk about a bit more technical things like BSD, ABSD, some of these terms in Singapore, which you may have not heard of, and about mortgage, how to use CPF, and we go through one very simple example about how to buy a private residential property in Singapore. Now, if you have not done so already, do watch the first part of my first video on this. And in the first video, I did, which I think I uploaded about roughly 2-3 weeks back, I did talk about why Singapore property is popular. Why Singapore prices are the way they are, what are the different type of properties that are available in Singapore, like residential, HDB, from you have commercial property, etc., and like the landed properties, right? What are the different types of categories of properties? And we focus a bit more about HDB, private residential condo, and executive condominium, because these three are the most common that you are likely to purchase. Okay, so that's what I covered in episode 1, and I strongly recommend you watch episode 1 first on my YouTube channel before you watch the rest of this video, right? And okay, so let me start. First of all, I need to say that, and I probably said this earlier in the first video, is that Singapore property market supply is very highly regulated. Unlike Malaysia and many other countries, land in Singapore for development is not easy to come by. There is generally only 2 ways to get land in Singapore. Number one is through a government land sale. The government has a schedule every year, what lands they intend to sell to developers for development. And second is what we call en bloc sales, where property developers buy existing buildings, right, and redevelop. And in Singapore, this is fairly common because Singapore is a small island and development land is scarce. So sometimes it does make commercial sense for developers to buy older buildings and redevelop. In Malaysia, this is not very common. In fact, it's still very new. In many countries, it's also not very common unless it's in the larger, bigger cities like maybe New York, Tokyo, London. But in Singapore, this is also common, right? But in Malaysia, even in KL, this doesn't really happen unless you're talking about the heart of KL, and it has only really recently started in the past few years, in KL, where we buy old buildings and build new ones. So it's very different in Singapore. So you cannot get land that easily to build housing in Singapore, and that's probably one reason why Singapore property prices have retained so much good value, because supply is in a way controlled. And the other thing is the Singapore government is very good at cooling measures. That means if they realize that the property market is going up too fast, the government does intervene and provide cooling measures as well. And the same thing HDB, right? Even though HDB is public housing, government housing, the government also controls, in a way, how much HDB is released and built every year. So So these are things to understand, right? And the other thing to understand, of course, is that we go to more technical things. So there's four things I will cover today. So one is stamp duty, buyer stamp duty. This is very common. I think every country has some form of taxation in this. So stamp duty basically refers to whenever you buy something, a major transaction, the government has a stamp duty, a charge on the document, on the sales and purchase document, right? So that's basically what stamp duty is. It's a form of government revenue, and so there is a buyer stamp duty. Okay, and due to property prices rising too fast, the government has introduced something called additional buyer stamp duty, called ABSD. Right, we will go into how that works, and there's something called seller stamp duty, another duty that you pay when you sell, right? And the fourth one, TDSR, refers to total debt servicing ratio. Basically, is a range of measures designed to control how much buyers can borrow from the bank when they buy a property. Okay, so I repeat, TDSR is a measure to control how much money you can borrow from a bank when you buy property. So actually, TDSR, actually, in my opinion, is one of the most difficult things to overcome, right? And of course, plus ABSD makes it very difficult in Singapore sometimes to buy more than one properties. But let's go into detail. So what is a BSD? So when you buy property, you need to pay stamp duty to the government. So BSD is based on purchase price. And if you look at the table here, I think it's quite straightforward. For residential properties, 1% up to the first 180,000, 2% for next 180,000, up to $1 million is 3%, and thereafter is 4%, right? So this is the stamp duty that you pay on the purchase price. So it's basically the more expensive it is, the more stamp duty that you pay. So there is a formula, but we'll go into that later. So this is basic, right? Every country, most countries have a similar table, right? Of course, the rates may differ, and the tiering may differ, but it's a similar table in every country. Okay, so this is number one, right? One transaction cost. Number two, we have something called ABSD. Now, ABSD, as I mentioned, is to prevent excessive multiple property purchases. So it's additional stamp duty, again, based on the purchase price. So now how does it work? Again, look at the table. So if you are Singaporean citizen, and you buy the first residential property, be it a HDB or a private residential condo or a landed property, it could be a landed property, right? Although unlikely, but the first residential one, there is no ABSD. It's basically 0%. So government does not penalize you if you are buying the first property, HDB, residential, or condo, or regardless. But if you do buy a second one, and this is very likely to be a condo or better, then you have to pay a 12% ABSD. So 12% of the purchase price, yeah. So if you pay $1 million for this second property, you have to pay an additional 12% to the government. It's tax, yeah. You don't get it back. You do not get it refunded unless unless you can prove that actually this second property is actually not the second property, it's the first property. You sold the first one, and in the process of selling the first one, and you're buying a second one, actually it will come back to one, right? You can actually claim a refund in that case, but government actually still require you to pay first. So basically, as long as you're buying a second property, you pay 12%. Third and subsequent 15%. So it's a very heavy tax. Yeah, if you think about it, in many countries, 12% is in a way a down payment for a new house, right? So it's you're buying a second house, second property, and you're paying 12% ABSD to the government. So it's a very hefty form of tax. So it's 12% plus the earlier BSD that in the previous slide. So that's the total stamp duty you have to pay if you are buying a second property. Now, if you are a permanent resident of Singapore, that means you're working in Singapore, you have a permanent residency status, right? When you buy the first property, you are only taxed 5%. So that even though it's the first one, be it HDB or private property, and again, you have to follow the other regulations relating to HDB, as I mentioned in my first video, right? But even if it's your first HDB, you still have to pay a 5% ABSD if you are a permanent resident. Okay, so 5%, and subsequently, it is second property onwards, it is 15%. So you can see the way ABSD designed for Singaporeans and permanent residents. First property is okay. Government does not penalize you, or only penalize you a bit if you are a PR. But first property, okay. Second onwards, then the taxes become very high, right? If you are a foreigner, any residential property, you automatically pay a 20% ABSD. 20%, I repeat. 20. So you buy $1 million condo, you have to pay an additional 200,000 as tax, okay, to the government, and non-refundable. And so can you imagine, this sort of deters foreigners a lot, in the sense that, I mean, I mean, most rational people, even if you have the money, right? I mean, people feel that, wow, 20%, you lose that 20% immediately upfront when you buy. So your property has to appreciate by at least 20% just to make back that tax, you see. So it's a significant mental barrier to overcome. I'm not saying that it stops all foreigners. Some foreigners who are deep pockets still buy, or who are very confident in Singapore, they still buy, right? Because they look at the long-term value of Singapore and they probably think 20% is something they can make back over a long-term period, right? But for many people, it sort of turns off and turns you off at the 20% ABSD for foreigners. So if you're not a permanent resident or you're not a Singaporean, this applies to you. Even if you're just a work pass. So if you are a Malaysian and you have a work pass only, you have to pay 20%. Or if you are a Malaysian and you have no status at all in Singapore, right? You are still treated as a foreigner, so 20%. Now, any entities, if you use a company, you pay 25% ABSD. So government is trying to direct residential property should only be owned by individuals, or individuals that should not be owned by companies. And the other thing is, if you are a property developer, you have to pay an additional 5% if you buy any residential property. This is basically for the en bloc scenario. So if the developer wants to buy an old building to rebuild, right? If that old building is a residential property, the developer does have to pay ABSD 25% plus 5% because they are under a company. So they effectively pay 30% extra to buy over an old building for en bloc purposes. Okay, I let it sink that in a little bit. So ABSD is a very hefty thing. It makes the cash requirement to buy property high, especially if you are buying a second or third property. Okay, ABSD. So next, I do a bit of case study. So case study one is I'm Michael. Michael's a Singaporean, right? And he's buying his first private residential property. Let's assume it's for easy calculation, $1 million Singapore dollars. He does not have any existing residential property in Singapore. So this is his first purchase. So he does pay 0% ABSD, right? Because he's a first time purchaser, and a BSD of 24,600. You can do the math on your own, right? So this is case study one. The most straightforward, easiest case. So you can see he doesn't really get affected because even though he's buying a private condo, he doesn't pay any what we call BSD because it is his first property, and so no additional tax, right? Now case study number two, Rachel is a Malaysian citizen, but she is a permanent resident of Singapore, and she has worked in Singapore for some time, and she says, I want to buy a condo in Singapore. So she buys a first private residential condo. Again, we use $1 million as an example. She does not own any existing property in Singapore or Malaysia, right? So she does pay a 5% ABSD, right, which is basically 50,000, and this is on top of a BSD. So you can see, right, in this scenario here, the difference between a Singaporean and a Malaysian, same scenario, right, is that the permanent resident pays 50,000 more, right, for $1 million property, right? So they are set back by, they have to come out an additional $50,000 cash as a permanent resident. If they're not permanent resident, then this 5% becomes 20%. So that you're talking about 200,000 Sing dollars, right? Okay. So next, seller stamp duty. Now, what is seller stamp duty? Is when you sell. Now, the reason why you have seller stamp duty is to prevent flipping, right? A lot of people buy property and hope that once they get the keys or in a short period of time, they can flip the property and make a gain, right? So it's a form of capital gains tax in a way, but it's not really capital gains because you do have to pay SSD whether you have capital gains or not, right? In most countries, you only pay a tax if you have gains, right? Like Malaysia model is a capital gain tax, so if you have gains, you pay a tax on the gains. But Singapore it doesn't look at that manner. How they do is they pay based on the price, so it doesn't matter what you are selling it for, as long as you sell it within a short period of time. So in Singapore case, it's up to 3 years, right? You have to pay a tax on the selling price. So regardless of profit or loss. So if you only hold the property for 1 year and you sell it, you have to pay 12% of the selling price, right? 2 years, 8%, 3 years, 4%. After 3 years, then only it becomes 0. So you have to hold the property for a minimum of 3 years before you sell to avoid SSD. So if you look at this case study again, Michael bought a condo in January 2019. He wants to sell it in March 2021. So that's basically the second to third year, right? And he's selling it for 1.2 million, right? He has to pay an SSD of 4%, which is 48,000. So it doesn't matter what was his purchase price. He could have bought it for $2 million. He could have bought it for $1 million. We don't care, right? We only look at the selling price. So the selling price is 1.2 million. So he has to pay an SSD of 4% because it's within the second year. If he wanted to avoid this, he would have waited for 1 more year, right? Then he doesn't have to pay this 4%. So SSD is basically to prevent flipping. Okay. Now the fourth thing is TDSR. So TDSR, I think if some of you work in financial sector or have some familiarity with mortgages, you would have heard of this term before, the debt servicing ratio. So banks normally assess whether you can borrow based on how much is your income versus how much are your outstanding debts you pay to the bank every month. So they take a percentage, right? How much is your total monthly debt repayments divided by your income, right? As you can see in the second point here, then times 100%. So that there's basically a percentage, right? TDSR is basically a percentage, right? So a TDSR should not exceed 60% in a Singapore situation. So Singapore government says that all banks must not allow a person's TDSR to exceed 60%. Now, this varies from country to country. Some countries go as high as 80% for debt servicing ratio. They're not regulated, but basically they let the banks decide. But generally, most banks do not do DSRs of more than 80%. But in Singapore, basically what they're trying to say is that the government is saying that all banks must follow this limit of 60%, right? You cannot give more than 60% DSR. So that's what this TDSR says. So, and the other thing that comes in with TDSR is it also affects the amount of financing that you get, right? Based on which property that you're buying. So, for example, and this is a great table. I got it online. I have to give credit to this person. It's a great table. And so if you're buying your first property and your loan tenure is up to 30 years, right, and your borrower is below 65 years, you can get a maximum 75% loan margin, right? If you are borrowing 30 years but your borrower is above 65 years old, then your margin is basically slashed to 55, right? And of course, if you're borrowing a long loan, like 31 to 35 years, right, and then your margin is also slashed to 55, right? So you can see, right, basically, again, it rewards younger borrowers buying the first property to be able to get maximum loan, which is 75. Okay, now if you take note that second property, right, it doesn't matter if you're still young. If you are buying a second property, right, and you are still young, right, your borrower is below 65%, the bank will only lend you 45. So just now in the earlier case, you remember ABSD, right? You have to pay ABSD because it's a second property. Let's say you're Singaporean or whatever. Let's assume you're Singaporean, right? And you're buying a second property. You have to pay ABSD 12%. Not only you have to pay 12%, because it's your second property, TDSR also reduces the amount of bank financing you can get. So you can only borrow 45. So you have to come out with a so-called 55% down payment. Of the 55% of what this rule says is 25% must be cash. Right, minimum. Out of the 55% that you're buying, 45% from the bank, second property, right? 45% from the bank, 25% must be, then the balance 55%. Of the balance 55%, 25% must be cash, minimum, and the rest 30% can be CPF, okay? But minimum must be 25. So you can have 55% cash if you really got so much cash, okay? And borrow 45% from the bank for your second property if you are below 65 years old and your loan tenure is not more than 30 years. Okay, so a lot of if here, okay, but basically it severely crimps a borrower's ability to buy a second private property, right, unless you have a lot of cash. Okay, so you need not only as you have to pay ABSD 12%, now you can only borrow 45% for the second property, and of that 55% differential, you have to come out minimum 25% cash. The rest can be from CPF, but I mean, again, I don't think your CPF was so much, right? But you must minimum 25% cash, right? So it's this is another very big limitation, right? So basically, you can see the way TDSR and ABSD they work together, right, is to crimp your ability to buy a second property unless you got a lot of cash, right? So you have to put a lot of cash into the second property, right? First property still okay, you can get 75%. But second property, third property, also you can see the loan to value, right? How much the bank will lend to you based on the purchase price drops pretty a lot, right? So next slide. So how about mortgages in Singapore? Singapore mortgages are like any other country. I mean, I don't see a very big. They're pretty advanced like any other country, and similarly, you provide income documents, payslip, bank statements, CPF, and then to your banker, and then make sure. The important thing is the banker wants to make sure your TDSR is within limits for the property that you're buying. And I think I mentioned this a bit in the first video also. But if you're buying a HDB loan, you're buying a HDB and you're getting loan from HDB, you can get 90% margin. That's for HDB only, and borrowing from HDB, but it's only 75% maximum for private banks, subject to the Tdsr rules earlier, right? So 75% maximum for private banks, subject to Tdsr rules earlier. So the good thing about Singapore is that interest rates are very, very low. I mean, sometimes, you know, Singapore interest rates are very low, right? Your mortgage is about 1% only, 1% plus nowadays, a little bit over 1%. I mean, it's very low compared to many countries in the world, right? Even Malaysia, Australia, London, you know, UK are all higher. US all about 4-5% on usually, right? So for Singapore to be 1% is a unique thing. Singapore has ultra low rates, but that's also because their savings accounts pay, you know, point something percent only, not even 1% savings accounts, right? So that's why it's extremely attractive to borrow, to buy property, because interest rates are very, very low. Okay, so let's talk about CPF a little bit. Now CPF. It's like the EPF in Malaysia. It's basically a retirement fund, right? So you every month your salary, part of it is contributed to this CPF, and the employer also contributes a portion, right? By law, they have to contribute. So this money goes into CPF, and CPF basically keeps this money until your retirement, right? And you get an interest on this every month. So depending on how CPF manages the money, right, you get a bit of interest from CPF every year. And you can use CPF to buy property. So there is some ways you can use CPF before you retire. So one things you can do is CPF is to buy property, and how it works is that you can only use CPF from the ordinary account. So again, like many countries, you can't use the entire CPF amount. There's only a certain portion in the ordinary account that you can use, right? You can't use funds from the other accounts in the CPF. So basically to explain, when you pay money to CPF every month, you contribute to CPF every month, right? And your employer contributes every month. This money is split into several accounts. So you can only use the ordinary account money to buy property. You can use it for down payment or monthly repayment or both. Also to pay stamp duty also can, right? And if you sell the property, you have to refund this money to CPF. So if you, for example, 5 years down the road, you sell the property, you have to refund this CPF. Whatever you taken from CPF has to be refunded first before you get any proceeds, right? So, and this has to be done with interest. So the CPF interest for the past 5 years, as I say, was like 4%, 4%, 4%. So you have to give refund to CPF with interest. Of course, if you do sell the property and buy again, you can use the CPF again. But basically, if you do sell the property, CPF wants the money back first before you can buy the next one. So yeah, right. So you basically it's not really free money in the sense, but you can. It is your money end of the day, but is that this money has some rules and regulations, because basically it's meant to be for your retirement. You're not supposed to take it out early and you know, and use it however you please, right? So that you can't buy the house, use it 5 years later, sell, and then don't expect to return the money to CPF. You have to return the money to CPF. Okay, so these are for people who have CPF, Singaporeans and people who are working in Singapore. Then you have some CPF. Of course, foreign buyers don't have this lah. Okay, next. So let's go through one example. How much does it cost to buy one property in Singapore? So just now we're talking about a lot of theory, maybe a bit dry and no example, right? So let's give you a proper example, right? So this is a 1-bedroom, right? Bought in last year, and it's transacted last year in May 2020, and about a year ago, right? I plucked it from URA. I just picked one transaction for real. I show you actual floor plan, right? It's a 1-bedroom unit, 463 square feet, right? And it was sold at 711,000, about 1,500 per square foot. This was in Tampines, right? I won't name the project, but just to give you an example, right? It's a real life example, right? We don't want theory. So 1-bedroom in Tampines, 700,000. Okay. Okay. So if you are Singaporean and you are a first-time buyer, okay, first-time buy property, right? So you have to come out 25% down payment, which is 177,000, of which 5% must be cash, right? The rest can be CPF. So when I put here 5% cash minimum means 5% must be cash. The rest can be CPF, right? Or it can be all cash. It's up to you, right? So 177,000. Stamp duty is 15,930. No ABSD, right? Because you are first-time buyer. So your total upfront is 193,000, and you assume that, and your mortgage will be 1,007, assuming certain conditions below 1.1% interest rate, 30-year loan, 75% maximum financing, right? Assuming that you are below 65 years of age. So this is the maximum scenario you can get. This is how much you pay every month if you are Singaporean. Okay. Now, if you are a permanent resident, right, the down payment is basically the same, also 177K, but stamp duty is also the same. But because you are a permanent resident, you have to pay ABSD, so additional 35,000. right? The 5% ABSD is basically the difference between you and a Singaporean, and assume that you're the same age, same profile, you can borrow, you basically pay the same money mortgage. The only difference is the 5% ABSD. So that's why a lot of people who work in Singapore, they try to become PR, right? At least PR, so that they can, it's easier to buy Singapore property, right? They may or may not become citizen, but at least PR, if you buy a property in Singapore, you do save quite a fair bit. The differential, there is some differential still to compare to citizen, but 5% in most cases is doable, right, for first property. Okay, so if I'm a Singaporean and I'm buying a second property, right, and I'm less than 65 years old, so because it's a second property, right, my cash requirement is higher, so I need to come out a 55% down payment. So 390,000 of this 25% must be cash. The balance can be CPF. Stamp duty is the same, right? Stamp duty doesn't matter which property it is, but because this is a second property, I need to pay ABSD, right? And the ABSD is 85,000, so my total is 492,000. So that is around half the purchase price already. So you can imagine, once I buy a second property, expect to come out half or more, because half or more, because your maximum financing is already 45, so you have to come out half, and then plus ABSD, or that you will come out more than half on the end of the day to buy a second property, right? So, but of course my mortgage will be low because I don't borrow so much, so only $1,000 mortgage. Now, if I'm a foreigner, first time buyer, I need to pay 25. So against 25% down payment. I'm a foreigner, so I don't have CPF, so definitely everything has to be cash, right? Stamp duty is the same regardless, and because I'm a foreigner, my ABSD is 20%, so my upfront is 35,000, and assuming I can borrow from the bank, I have to pay the same mortgage as earlier as a first buyer. Okay, so you can see in these 3-4 scenarios, just to buy a 700,000 property, right? How much cash you need? How much cash you need? Okay, I hope these slides help. You can go back and rewind a bit in this video if you need to take a look at the math properly, but I'm sure this explains a lot. Okay, now next. So we're coming to the end of the video, but basically a few key learning points, right, from the slides so far. So number one is, if you buy the first property, the rules are the most lenient, right? So not to say that government don't want you to buy a house, but you have to be buy the first house. Buy first house is okay, of course, especially if you buy HDB. But as I mentioned in my first video, there are some rules for buying HDB. But if you're buying a first condo, I mean, the rules are fairly lenient, right? We don't talk about price expensive or not, but the rules are the most lenient if you're buying the first property. And the way the rules are designed is Singaporeans get the most benefits, of course, because they're citizen, and then followed by permanent residents by foreigners and companies. Okay, so foreigners and companies are the most discriminated against if you are buying property in Singapore. Now, if you buy a second property though, then again, you get hit very hard by ABSD in terms of how much additional tax you have to pay, and financing is also restricted. So expect to pay 50% or more of the purchase price because of ABSD and Tdsr in terms of down payment, right? And how does this work now when you have all these rules in place, right? So what happens in Singapore is that a lot of property agents talk about asset progression, right? So asset progression means this model, what it means is that first, you graduate from university, you get married, you buy HDB. Okay, the HDB is completed, right? In a few years' time, you stay in the HDB, you achieve your 5 years minimum occupation period, the MOP, right? And then once your MOP is over, right, your HDB should have appreciated. In most cases, it has, right? And it has a will, and you then sell the HDB and take the proceeds of the HDB to upgrade to a private property. So that's what they call by asset progression, right? And typically your income would have been higher than then, and so you would be able to upgrade to a private property. So this is the model that the property asset progression model in Singapore, the typical path for anyone who lives in Singapore on how to upgrade their wealth in terms from a property perspective, right? So HDB first, right? After HDB clear the MOP, you sell, and by then you would have made money, and then you upgrade to private property. So that's how it typically works. If your HDB does make a lot of money, then you may not just buy one private property, you may buy one private property to stay and buy a second investment, right? Investment property. So that's typically depends, right? So depends on how much you make on the HDB sale. You can do that. Some people may not even need to sell the HDB, right? If the active income is high enough, once they clear the MOP, they can immediately buy private property without selling the HDB. That's also possible. I mean, no one says you have to sell the HDB to buy a private property. You just have to clear the MOP only, right? But then of course when you do that, then basically you have an issue with ABSD, right? Because it becomes a second property. So if your active income is very high, that might be possible, right? The other thing that people do is they split their names, right? So they may take out names from the first property so that the one name is free, husband and wife, right? So they may take out the husband name from the first property, leave the wife in the first property, so that the husband may be able to buy the second property without being affected by ABSD, right? That's also possible if your active income on one person is high enough, right? So basically, yeah, so this is how it works, right? Typically, the process, right? Asset progression process in Singapore. Okay, so how's the Singapore property market in 2021? Again, I'm borrowing a slide from Sidley Reads. I think it's a very nice slide that talks about key things to consider about. So number one is I mean, Singapore economy has been supported very well by the government because of COVID, right? And you can see government has put in a lot of money into the economy, and of course, but of course, it's still difficult. COVID is still a problem globally, not just in Singapore. Of course, Singapore also has recently a recent resurgence in the virus that may depress market conditions. But actually, Singapore has gone through a pretty good market rally in the past 1 year, 2 year, and one of the things that we're considering this year, will developers start to buy en bloc again because government land sales is not sufficient. They may want to buy en bloc to put more product into the market because property prices in Singapore have been doing well. A lot of developers are selling well, and they maybe don't have enough stock. The other thing is to consider also at HDB MOP. There's a lot of HDBs they're getting MOP in last year, this year, and one thing to consider is that once you get MOP, you free up all these buyers to upgrade, right, to private property. So that's where property agents will start to engage these owners and say, hey, your MOP is already over. Would you like to consider upgrading to a private property? And they will do all the calculations and math and to see whether that makes sense or not. And of course, it's a typical aspiration of people in Singapore to upgrade from HDB to private because there is a lot of benefits that come with private property, right? And not just status, but of course of the lifestyle changes, right? It's like lifestyle upgrades in a way. So that's also another thing. And the third thing, of course, interest rates, right? Because of COVID, interest rates across the world are very cheap, are lower. Okay, lower, I won't say very cheap, lower, especially in Singapore, is very, very low. So that also encourages buyers to buy. So these are things to consider. And thank you very much. I hope you learned a lot from this video. My intention now for this video wasn't it to be too long. That's why we cut it into 2 different videos. And otherwise, one video don't be way too long. So 2 shorter videos. I hope that helps you understand how to buy property in Singapore, right? And whether you are working in Singapore today, you may not be working in Singapore, but at least that gives you some idea. If you find that I was going too fast, you can pause and rewind it a bit. I think that will help you understand the math better. And it's a bit technical, this one, because Singapore's like that, right? And I hope if you like our video, do find us on YouTube to like, subscribe to our video, and find us on Facebook. Also, we're on Malaysian Investors in Singapore. It's a group on Facebook, and you can ask us questions there, or you can feel free to drop me an email at this email or my Singapore phone number, and we can talk about Malaysia, we can talk about Singapore, we can talk about any other country where real estate is one of my big passions. So and as long as you're asking smart questions, I mean, I'm always very happy to talk property with you. Okay, so thank you very much, and hope you have a great day, and everyone stay safe in fighting COVID. Thank you.